Thank you. Well, for our three excellent papers, we have a master commentator, Johnson Kent Wright. Kent Wright is Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. He's also, as I'm sure you all know, co-editor of French Historical Studies. Dan's already referred to his book on Matli, a classical republican in 18th century France, political thought of Matli. Kent is the author of many articles, book chapters, dictionary entries on the Enlightenment, republicanism, political culture of the old regime of the French Revolution, and he's working among many other things on the book on the Atlantic Republican tradition. Okay.
Thank you, Keith. I've got no visuals either, and in fact, when I was invited to do this, I swore an inner oath to myself that there were two words I would not mention in the course of the comment, and those words are Jonathan Israel. But the name has already been uttered, and so I will. Those of you who are readers of, say, the beginning of his third volume will know that he begins it by issuing a warning, alluding to but not citing a famous essay by James Schmidt about the Enlightenment, warning his readers that to speak of the Enlightenment is, of course, anachronistic. It wasn't until about a century later that the term "the Enlightenment" began to circulate as a historical object, and that there were prodromes of this kind of talk in the 18th century, talk about Illuminismo, Lumière, Aufklärung, and so forth, but you had to discriminate very carefully how these terms were used. Now you will know then, if you've read the 1,000 pages that follow, that not once in them does Jonathan Israel return to this subject of the post-18th century constructions of the Enlightenment or uses of this terminology. In fact, he proceeds directly on the next page to speak not only of the Enlightenment and nothing but the radical Enlightenment with a capital R and E. So one thing that is marvelous about all three of these papers, because Israel, in fact, he has a definition of the Enlightenment, in fact, with a radical inner essence, whose traces he can then follow through the 17th and 18th century. What's marvelous about these papers is their procedure is exactly the opposite. It is to do what Israel warns us we should do, but doesn't do, which is to look at the actual use of the terminology, and not the use of the terminology, to actually look at, and what we get to see in all of these projects is, in fact, something like the semi-conscious, semi-obscure self-creation of the Enlightenment, in and through the very metaphors of light and darkness, at the top of the Enlightenment, through the use of the terminology, which, as Stan says, is probably the ideological glue of this particular world, a common sense conviction of the existence of natural rights, and then from below through what promises to be a phenomenology of enlightenment. What was it like to feel the inner shuddering, in fact, of your life changing via what might be called actually existing enlightenment in the 18th century? That's one marvelous thing about these papers. The other marvelous thing about them is these are three of the most dynamic and imaginative minds working in our field, and they have very, very generously let us look at projects right at their very start, inviting us into the workshop of the historian. And they've done it modestly, as though we're going to have some advice for them or some help. It's actually a great privilege for us to see how these three very different projects, but all related in this way, are forming themselves and taking flight. In terms of Darren's project, here you have, you didn't laugh at his first joke, and I was astonished that nobody laughed when he said this will be a short little book. How could this be a short little book? In fact, when he promises to do three things: to give us an investigation that we've never really had of the actual usage of the metaphor or reality, the linguistic, the intellectual history, not of the idea of the Enlightenment, but of this whole discursive field in 18th century France, and then to move from that to its instrumentalization in multiple contexts. And as though that's not enough for a short little book, then to address the dialectic of enlightenment too. I mean, what is there to say? This is a case of making no small plans. The first of those themes invites and makes me think of nothing else nothing more than the Becker thesis of secularization. He alludes very briefly to the fact that the terminology, the discursive field we're looking at here is not merely the secular 18th, that of the secular 18th century Enlightenment, but there are virtually no scriptural religious traditions, and even non-scriptural ones, that don't use this terminology. And I can't be the only one in the audience who hasn't got about 6 weeks into a course on the Enlightenment, where a student shuffles up to you and kind of says, you know, this is actually kind of interesting, as it turns out, but when are we going to get to the bit about nirvana? Which is actually, at the first few times I was flummoxed by that. It's not an uninteresting question. The answer, of course, is, well, never in this class. But Darren at least is committed to taking us there to some extent, because he has, going into this topic, he has to confront, I think, the 7-week boot question here, and it goes right to the heart of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment secularized religious thought. These seem like old questions, but there'll be thrilling ones in the hands of a practitioner who can soar over the centuries and then land in a specific spot the way that Darren does. The other thing, of course, is just the dialectic of enlightenment. It's thrilling to see, and this is the case with all 3 of these papers, someone who is taking us back to the heart of definitions of the Enlightenment, self-definitions at the time, and are willing to take us on into the revolution without a prefabricated, without knowing how the story ends, without the comforting telos that you find in Jonathan's reading of it, and it's which couldn't be less dialectical. So we have something to look forward to in finding out what l'entendre means exactly. And at the beginning of Emma Rothschild's chapter 2, she has paper 2, she has a very moving line saying enlightenment allows you to see and also permits you to be seen, in fact. Before that, we have to confront Dan and John Locke and all of that. Dan's project puts me in line of a remark I've repeated before in conversation. Istvan Hunt, I can remember years ago, saying, "You lot in French history are very lucky. You have everything left to do." And what he meant, of course, is speaking from Cambridge, that we've virtually exhausted the veins of Hobbes and Locke, political economy, Smith, whereas the light of Cambridge has yet to fall on France. And this is a little bit of the extension of the sort of the Cambridge style, to some extent, although Dan wears many more hats than Cambridge had, on a subject that's absolutely central. And I think Dan's exactly right. The lacuna is absolutely amazing. We're all convinced of the centrality of the 17th century natural rights tradition. We're convinced that this was the ideological common coin of the age of Atlantic revolutions. But for France in particular, the story in between hasn't been told. We know who the dramatis personae are, roughly, but piecing together the narrative of transition there is left to do. And Dan, some of Dan's suggestions here are that instead of thinking about the invention of rights talk in the 18th century, that we think of its transformation of work, and he suggests that probably the pivot or hinge here might be epistemological. He has those drastic things to say about the disappearance of Locke. It's Bernard Bailyn saying Locke had nothing to do with the American Revolution and nothing to do with the French either. But and actually, I don't know if I was going to read this. I'm going to read it. Until I heard that comment, I'd almost forgot about it. Here's Mably, in fact, writing to his patron, the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, in 1764. The Duke obviously had been reading the second treatise. Mobley was pushing it on him, and we don't have the Dukes. And so, but this is Mobley back to whatever the Duke had said. He said, a garde du corps would be astonished to hear thoughts coming from someone like you about that subject. If you took less pleasure in it than you obviously do, I would pull out all the stops in praising Locke. There is nothing like Locke. If you read Locke, if you become Locke, then you will have the germ of all natural right. And then you can read everybody else without danger of making errors. So I just point that out. That may I'm just saying, for Mably himself, the number won't be 0. It'll be at least 1, and maybe 2. But the point is I don't think Locke is the linchpin here. This is a Locke hand puppet, and you were actually right. Actually, I think the names, the vanishing mediators here, where you get your Locke from here, I think that they're all Swiss. I think you're going to be spending, because this wasn't just a matter of the French Enlightenment, I think you'll be spending a lot of time turning the pages of Renanaki, Barderac, and Vattel. I think that that's the way out of the real world transmission and reception that you get from Hobbes and Locke to the Declaration of Rights. A final point on that subject is you're probably right that there's an epistemological change of temperature and opinion here too. There's an older story that turns not on epistemology that says the story we're telling from the 17th century to 1776 or 1789 is one of progressive radicalization. And the token of that radicalization was an idea, the idea that some rights are inalienable, that what was shared down to some point was the notion that a right, by definition, is a piece of property, it is alienable, and that at some point, and usually the story is Locke had something to do with this, the idea, the shocking new and contradictory idea of an inalienable right took over the world and became very central to rights talk. Its sentiment and sensibility is. And you're going to have to tell us when that change occurred, too. You'll have to grapple with this. And that, of course, will take you not to Mably, who didn't grapple with. He just uttered the term inalienability without grappling. The grappler there was, of course, Hobbes. And Hobbes, or I'm sorry, my punchline, the Hobbes was Rousseau, in fact. And Rousseau was the least Lockean and the greatest of all 18th century French natural rights thinkers. But his thought turns obsessively around conditions in which rights can be alienated and then retaken. And then Emma Rothschild's beautiful project, in fact, which would be a kind of a pendant or tandem to Dan's, which is a recreation of what's happening at the top, or as in the Brodelian phrase, the kind of in the phosphorescent flotsam and jetsam of the Enlightenment, the business of the makers and breakers of states. Down below that is the popular Enlightenment, like the popular Reformation. People living, whether they quite know it or not, but they know it by oxymoronic ways, enjoying an obscure enlightenment, have lived a life that historically can be recreated as an enlightened one. And the gamble here will be to take the glimpses that we're seeing here of the Rizah family, who are all printers essentially working for religious institutions until they aren't anymore, institutions that were once Jesuit, and then after a specific date they're no longer Jesuits. And adjacent to the printing world, then the world of the brothers-in-law, who went from an artisanal background, climbed their way up into the world of learning and teaching over extraordinarily long lives. It's very moving to see these men get to the post-revolutionary period, even after 1815. And then this is a centerpiece story of Francois Laflanche. The story of, if that's not enlightened, I don't know what is. In fact, by way of this scrappy litigation, in fact exposing how the tie actually worked on the ground. The payoff here will then be a kind of a dialectic of enlightenment too. That case came to its end in 1789, I think. The brothers, the printing family, they lived on through the dialectic of enlightenment that we know is the revolution. And that will be the payoff, is to take the horizontal depiction of this actually existing enlightenment on the ground and also render it vertical over time. You've probably already thought of this, but seeing your preliminary data makes me think there's several distinguished models of visualization in the revolution we're leaving. Dan has contributed a lot to that too. Your evidence makes me think of nothing too. It's something from literary criticism. Franco Moretti's manifestos for a literary criticism based on maps, graphs, and trees for capturing both the spatial, the horizontal dimension of novels from city to countryside, and also the vertical dimension that these are narrative forms. And you can already see, I think, your fragments, especially when the visualization like that is applied, reaching that end. And I've reached my end. You will notice that, like the cleverest commentators, I've failed to pose any questions, leaving that for you. But I'll finish with I think, a very decent proposal. I suggest that, having seen these projects at their birth, that we all get together, if not in the same place, but the same cast here. What will it take? 2 or 3? Maybe 3 or 4 years when these books are fresh out. Bring books and authors, maps, and trees and graphs all together again, and I guarantee, no pun intended, the results will be illuminating. Thank you very much.